quiet afternoon can turn into a storm without warning, and what looks like routine can unravel into the kind of truth that shakes entire cities. This series begins in a place you might walk past every day, with people you'd never expect. But what unfolds will pull back the curtain on power, silence, and betrayal in ways that no one imagined. The greatest twist is hidden in plain sight, and the deeper we go, the more you'll realize how fragile the line is between ordinary life and history being rewritten. If stories like this matter to you, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think of the plot and where you're watching from. I want to hear your voice in this conversation. Maya's body jerked backward from the force of the bullet, the air leaving her lungs in silence, because silence was all she had ever known. The steps beneath her felt cold, her fingers twitching weakly, as though still trying to finish the words she had been signing when her world collapsed. Her sketchbook, which she carried everywhere like a shield, fell open, scattering pages across the stone steps, pages filled with colored pencils and ink sketches of children like her. Children who never saw themselves in comic books or movies. Children she wanted to turn into superheroes. Black girls with hearing aids, boys in wheelchairs with glowing armor. Characters who saved the day not with fists or weapons, but with open hands raised to the sky. Now those same drawings fluttered in the wind like broken wings, stained with dust, as if the future she imagined had been ripped apart in an instant. Officer Crow stood frozen, his chest rising and falling too fast, the barrel of his gun still trembling in his hand. His partner, Officer Brett Hanley, reached out and shoved him hard in the chest, shouting, "Jesus, Crow, stand down. She's down. She's just a kid." But Crow's face twisted with denial, his lips pulling back as he barked. She wasn't listening. She was throwing signs, gang signs. I told her to stop. She didn't stop. Hanley's voice cracked in return. "She couldn't hear you, damn it. She's deaf." Across the street, Angela Morris sprinted from her cafe, apron still tied around her waist. Phone raised high to capture every second. Her voice cut across the chaos. "You shot a deaf child, you racist piece of trash." She pointed at the sketchbook on the ground, at the color drawings already blowing into the street. She wasn't a threat, she was an artist. She was singing with her hands. Crow turned toward her, eyes narrowing, but Hanley grabbed his elbow to stop him from advancing, because Angela's voice wasn't the only one. Other bystanders were pulling out their phones, recording, muttering, gasping, asking each other what they had just witnessed. A woman clutched her toddler tightly to her chest and stumbled away from a library. A teenage boy dropped his bicycle in the street and froze, wide-eyed. A man crouched beside Maya's bleeding body, dialing 911, his voice frantic, not realizing he was calling for help from the very institution that had just fired the gun. Maya's cochlear implant had been knocked from her ear, skittering across the pavement, buzzing faintly before it went silent, as broken as the body lying beside it. The silence around her wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating, filled with the pounding vibrations of feet, the crash of voices, the distant wail of sirens racing toward the scene. She didn't hear it, but her body felt it in waves, vibrations that told her the world was collapsing around her. Her hand twitched again, not with intent, but with reflex, and the movement was captured on video. One final sign that her body refused to stop speaking even when her voice had been stolen. Squad cars pulled up, lights flashing red and blue, sirens slicing through the growing crowd. More officers poured out, shouting commands that no one listened to, because by then the crowd wasn't afraid of them anymore. The crowd was watching them. Angela's camera didn't shake. It stayed locked on Crow's face, and her voice rang out again. "She was deaf. You fool, you didn't even care. You just saw her skin, saw her hands, and you fired." Hanley's own voice shook as he turned to Crow and muttered low, "They've got video." They all saw. "We're done." But Crow didn't answer. His gaze locked forward, as if by pretending not to see the blood pooling on the stone, it would somehow erase what he had done. The tension rippled through the onlookers like heat, whispers rising into shouts, anger gathering force. High school students from Jefferson High began spilling onto the street, drawn by text messages, tweets, and whispers moving faster than sirens could. One student uncapped a can of spray paint and scrawled 3 words on the wall of the library. #Justice for Maya. The bright red paint glistened in the fading light, and suddenly the wall itself became part of the story. Maya lay on the ground, her chest rising shallowly, her skin pale, her lips cracked, but her heart still fighting. Paramedics arrived, kneeling quickly, cutting away her hoodie, pressing gauze against her chest, their hands moving fast, their faces pale with disbelief. "She's just a kid," one whispered, shaking his head as the blood soaked through the bandages faster than they could replace them. 14, another muttered. "She's only 14. A nurse glanced at the intake form as they loaded her into the ambulance. One emergency contact listed, Marcus Johnson. The name made her pause. She didn't know why, but she had heard it before, somewhere, whispered in circles where names carried weight like thunder. He had promised himself he was done with this world, that he would never return to the shadows that had nearly consumed him after his wife's death. But the implant in Maya's body, designed not just as a medical aid, but as a hidden emergency signal, had gone off. It was a signal only he could receive, a signal he hoped never to hear again, and as the vibration pulsed against his earpiece, he understood what it meant instantly. His daughter was in danger, and the life he had built in silence was over. Marcus straightened his back, slid the badge from his neck, and closed the file in front of him without a word. He had waited years to be just a father, making pancakes on Sunday mornings, helping with sketches, staying away from the networks and the secrets that had once defined him. Now he felt the old weight settle across his shoulders, the instinct that came from decades of knowing when enemies moved against him, the sharpened awareness that said time was running out. He didn't ask permission, didn't explain. He simply left the office, walked down the sterile hallway with measured steps, and by the time the staff realized he was gone, his flight plan was already filed under an alias, his jet lifting off into the night. At Andrews Air Force Base, the Gulfstream jet cut through thin clouds, no insignia, no manifest, just shadows carrying him south. Marcus did not pack. He did not need clothes or bags. He carried only a guitar case slung across his back, an object ordinary on the outside, but loaded with everything he required to wage war if war came. In the silence of the cabin, he sat with his thoughts, the hum of the engines blending with the hum inside his chest. He remembered Danielle, his wife, lying in a car wreck years before, her death dismissed as mechanical failure, though he had known it was punishment for her refusal to stay quiet about police abuse. He had buried his grief, hidden himself, and promised that his daughter would never be touched by that world again. Now history had come for her. Back in Jefferson, doctors scrambled around Maya as she was wheeled into the trauma bay. Dr. Caroline Whitmore yanked on gloves, barking orders to her team. The child on the gurney was pale, her braids falling loose, her lips dry. She looked impossibly small under the harsh lights. Caroline froze when the intake chart was handed to her, and she read the name of the emergency contact, Marcus Johnson. She didn't say anything, but the name coursed through her like ice water. She had heard it whispered before in hushed tones around Washington circles, the kind of name you only said if you were ready to deal with consequences. She had thought it was a rumor, a myth of a man who had worked in programs that officially never existed. But now that name was written in bold at the top of a file belonging to a 14-year-old bleeding on her table. While surgeons worked, Marcus's jet touched down outside Jefferson with no ceremony, no escort. The night air smelled of jet fuel and rain. Two figures waited for him at the edge of the tarmac, Rachel Boone and Ethan Cole, trusted allies who had stayed in the game even after he disappeared. Rachel, sharp-eyed, hoodie drawn up, a flash drive already spinning between her fingers, spoke first. "You didn't say much on the flight." Marcus's voice was calm, stripped of emotion. "I was calculating." Ethan nodded grimly. "Hospital's on lockdown. She's alive, barely. Cops are already twisting the story." Marcus looked up at the sky, its golden edges giving way to darkness, and said quietly, "Then we burned their version. Every lie, every tape, every file. They don't get to hide." Across town, Officer Crow sat stiffly in the front seat of his patrol car, his service weapon resting heavy in his holster, his mind buzzing. "She didn't stop," he muttered. "I told her, and she didn't stop." Hanley, sitting beside him, turned with a sharp voice. "She couldn't hear you. You didn't give her a chance." But Crow just stared ahead, jaw locked, refusing to let doubt seep in. Hanley's words pressed harder. "They've got video. That woman from the cafe recorded everything." Still, Crow said nothing, watching other squad cars pull in, watching lights flash, watching the crowd gather. His silence was a mask, but behind it his world was unraveling. As the hospital filled with doctors and nurses fighting to stabilize Maya, word spread through Jefferson. Teens poured out of the high school, some carrying handmade signs, others painting the library wall with brighter letters. Protesters began to gather before the mayor had even been briefed, anger rising like a storm too large to contain. The town was awake now, whispers turning to cries, outrage taking root. In the quiet corridors of the hospital, Caroline's hands trembled as she worked, whispering under her breath, "Who the hell are you, kid?" She didn't know yet that the answer was not only Maya Johnson, but the daughter of a man who had once helped build systems designed to see everything. And now he was back to make sure they saw what they wanted to bury. By the time Marcus slipped into Jefferson under his alias, using a forged janitor's badge and an access key, his face was unreadable, his mind a weapon. He moved through the hospital like a man who had studied its map long before he needed it, Rachel and Ethan trailing behind, silent. They didn't speak in the elevator. They didn't need to. Every second was calculated, every step part of a plan still forming. Outside Trauma Room 4, Marcus paused, watching through the glass as doctors worked over his daughter. Blood pooled beneath gauze, tubes snaked into her arms. Machines beeped faintly with fragile signals. His daughter was alive, but barely. He pressed his hand against the glass, eyes hollow, his silence heavier than steel. He would not let her story end this way. Ethan Cole kept to the rear, broad-shouldered and vigilant, his gaze cutting through every shadow and corner like a sentry expecting an ambush. Together they blended into the rhythm of a hospital night, slipping between nurses with clipboards, doctors whispering over charts, and orderlies rushing with supplies. None of them saw the storm walking right past them, a father whose daughter lay bleeding in surgery. Marcus didn't waste time with emotion. He carried it heavy and hidden, but his mind was fixed on one thing, understanding exactly what had happened and why. The story being whispered outside the hospital walls was already shifting. Crow's version was making rounds, the narrative of a non-compliant suspect, twisted to fit a protocol defense. Marcus knew better. He had lived in the shadows long enough to know when a story was being written before the ink was even dry. Now his task was to burn that story down before it consumed his daughter. On the 4th floor, past the trauma wing, Marcus stopped at a maintenance kiosk, an old terminal barely functioning. But that was exactly the kind of machine he preferred. Rachel dropped to one knee, sliding a flash drive into the port, her fingers tapping across keys with surgical precision. "Security logs are sloppy," she muttered. "No two-factor authentication, barely any encryption. God, these people are amateurs." Marcus stood behind her, arms crossed, watching the hallway. Ethan leaned against the wall, his eyes never still, ready for anyone who wandered too close. Rachel's screen filled with cascading lines of data, hospital logs, dispatch calls, time-stamped reports. "Find me the law enforcement interface," Marcus said quietly, his voice flat but commanding. "Dispatch logs, flag reports, any federal notifications." Rachel nodded. "Already on it." Inside Trauma Room 4, Dr. Caroline Whitmore barked orders as her team fought to stabilize Maya. The girl's chest rose and fell shallowly, her heart stuttering against the wires that traced her fragile life onto monitors. Blood soaked through gauze faster than they could replace it. Caroline's hands moved fast, but her eyes flicked toward the intake chart again and again, the name at the top echoing in her mind like a warning. Marcus Johnson. The room filled with the copper scent of blood and the sharp whir of machines, but outside the glass, Marcus stood motionless, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than anything she had ever known. Rachel's voice pulled him back. "Marcus," she said, her tone shifting. "There's number 911 call logged before the first shot." Marcus turned, his jaw tightening. "What?" Rachel's fingers flew over the keys. Nothing from a civilian. Not even anonymous. No radio traffic until after the shot. The first alert in the system is an internal flag from inside the precinct, 6 minutes before Crow fired. Ethan straightened, his brows furrowed. Internal flag? On what grounds? Rachel tapped, pulling up metadata. Subject, black female. Possible erratic behavior. Behavioral flag, unrecognized hand motions. Recommendation, approach with caution. Ethan swore under his breath. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his voice low and steady. She was signing. Rachel's reply came quickly. This wasn't AI. This was manual. Someone typed it in. From Terminal 4B. Logged in under the credentials of Captain Howard Mason. The name hung in the air like a curse. Marcus exhaled slowly, his fists tightening at his sides. He hunted her. Rachel's voice dropped. Mason used the AI as cover. He wanted it to look like predictive tagging, but this was targeted. He wrote the narrative before Crow even raised his gun. Ethan leaned closer, his face darkening. Mason used to be internal affairs in Atlanta, right? Didn't he vanish after an excessive force investigation? Marcus nodded grimly. Reassigned quietly to Jefferson. Guess what program he's running now? Fortis Defense's Predictive Threat Index pilot. Rachel's screen lit with personnel files, linked contracts, and encrypted memos. He's using beta-level AI to flag kids in public as threats. Not scanning Marcus. Labeling. And then waiting for someone to act. Ethan clenched his fists. They're turning sign language into gang signs. They're turning a child into a profile that justifies a bullet. Rachel's voice sharpened. I've got a training document tied to Mason's login. Says discretionary deployment was approved directly by city leadership. No council vote, no oversight, just a signature from Mayor Evelyn Drake. Ethan cursed under his breath. Marcus stared at the screen, the glow reflecting in his hard eyes. His voice was quiet but lethal. She wasn't even doing anything. She was drawing, walking, signing lyrics to herself. That was her crime. Black, young, disabled, alone, and unreadable to them. Difference is danger in this country. Always has been. Through the glass, Marcus's gaze shifted back to Maya's silhouette under the surgical lights. He saw her small chest rising unevenly, saw the blood-stained gauze, saw the tubes taped across her skin. The memory of Danielle came back unbidden. His wife, who had once told him, "They don't fear our anger. They fear our clarity, our ability to name what they're trying to hide." Marcus's jaw set, and his words came out like steel. "We name it all. Every file, every flag, every order." Rachel rose from a kiosk, her flash drive already loaded with data. "Then we go to war." Ethan's eyes stayed on Maya through the window. She's just a kid. Marcus didn't flinch. She's not just anything. She's everything. And they tried to erase her with a bullet. Now we erase them with the truth. The same man who had quietly authored the behavioral flag labeling Maya's innocent movements as erratic and suspicious had a long trail of shadows behind him, and Marcus was going to make sure every one of them was dragged into the light. Rachel pulled up personnel records that showed Mason had once served in Atlanta as part of internal affairs before vanishing in the middle of an excessive force investigation. His career salvaged not by accountability, but by reassignment. He had landed in Jefferson, buried beneath the title of captain, running a new predictive policing pilot program sponsored by Fortis Defense, the private contractor behind the Predictive Threat Index system. The deeper Rachel dug, the more damning the connections became. Discretionary deployment authorized through emergency funds, oversight bypassed, and every major approval stamped by the office of Mayor Evelyn Drake. Mason hadn't stumbled into this. He had crafted it deliberately, a system that turned difference into threat and gave officers like Crow the cover they needed to fire bullets into children like Maya. Ethan Cole's voice rumbled low as he leaned against the wall, watching both the hallway and the data flow on Rachel's screen. "This isn't panic," he muttered. "This is design." He wrote the rules to make sure she could never win. Marcus's gaze was locked on the monitor as Rachel pulled up a training document tied to Mason's login. Its text clinical and cold. Unrecognized hand motions equal potential gang signaling. Increased threat profile. Use elevated caution. Approach with readiness for escalation. Marcus's jaw tightened. They had taken the language of his daughter, the one thing she had to connect with the world, and twisted it into justification for lethal force. Rachel's voice sharpened with disgust as she read the fine print aloud. Approved under discretionary authority. No counsel review. No civilian oversight. Ethan cursed under his breath, pacing, his anger radiating in the quiet space. Marcus stayed still, but inside his chest, something old and sharp was reawakening. The part of him that had once written surveillance programs to identify patterns of foreign insurgents. He recognized the architecture of what Mason had built. It wasn't predictive. It was premeditated. Through the glass, Marcus's eyes flicked back to Maya, her small body tangled in wires and tubes, machines keeping her fragile heart alive. He saw Danielle's face in hers, his late wife who had died years earlier after daring to file a complaint against a sheriff who slammed a deaf student against a locker. Danielle had been silenced in the shadows, her death buried under paperwork that called it mechanical failure. But Marcus knew it had been punishment for telling the truth. He had buried that rage once, locked it away to protect his daughter, but now it surged back, filling him with clarity. Mason had done more than target Maya. He had repeated history. He had carried forward the same cruelty that had killed Danielle, the same contempt for anyone who dared to exist outside the narrow lines of compliance. Marcus whispered, almost to himself. He hunted her. Rachel looked up at him, eyes hard. So what do we do now? Marcus's voice was steady. We build the case. Every file, every log, every order signed in the dark. We pull it all, and when the time comes, we bury them with their own words. Ethan nodded slowly, though his fists were still clenched. Mason thinks he's safe, that the AI will carry the blame, that Crow's panic will be the excuse. But we've got the truth, and the truth is sharper than any weapon. Marcus said nothing more, but his silence carried the weight of decision. Elsewhere in the hospital, Dr. Caroline Whitmore scrubbed her hands and fought to keep her focus on the girl in front of her rather than the storm she knew was building beyond those walls. She had seen the name Marcus Johnson before, and she knew if the man behind it was truly here, then the narrative being spun by Jefferson police would not survive the night. The trauma bay was heavy with the smell of copper and antiseptic, the rhythm of machines steadying Maya's fragile body, but Caroline could feel the pulse of something larger, a reckoning pressing against the walls of her hospital. Across town, Captain Mason sat in his office, staring at a screen filled with error codes and flashing red warnings that told him someone had breached the precinct system. His phone pressed against his ear, he muttered to a superior voice. She wasn't compliant. The system flagged her. It followed protocol. The voice on the other end was cold, detached. Then keep quiet. Let it die down. Mason repeated the words, clinging to them, but unease gnawed at him. He had buried investigations before, silenced complaints, bent protocols until they broke, but this felt different. The light blinking red on his console was proof that someone was inside, and Mason knew enough about ghosts in the system to know what that meant. Marcus Johnson was back, in the safe corner of the hospital where Rachel and Ethan worked. The evidence piled higher. They uncovered budget memos linking Fortis Defense to Jefferson's discretionary funds, showing money meant for school safety programs rerouted into predictive policing contracts. They found emails between Mason and Mayor Drake discussing community stability strategy, a phrase that thinly veiled the reality of criminalizing youth of color under the guise of public safety. Rachel shook her head, muttering, "This is bigger than Mason. This goes all the way to City Hall." Ethan's eyes darkened. "Then we bring them all down." Marcus looked at them both, then turned back toward the glass where his daughter lay. His voice was quiet, steady, and final. "We don't just bring them down. We make sure the world sees how they fall." The harsh smell of antiseptic clung to the air, and the faint beeping of machines was steady but fragile, each sound carrying with it the weight of hope balanced against despair. His hand pressed lightly against the glass, his jaw tight, and the longer he stood there, the more the memories returned. The memories he had buried so deeply he had convinced himself they no longer existed. The present bled into the past, and once again Marcus was standing not in a hospital, but in Montgomery County years ago, staring at the burned-out wreck of a sedan where his wife Danielle had drawn her last breath. Danielle Johnson had been a public school teacher, the kind of woman who filled rooms with warmth and carried truth in her voice even when it cost her. She had been quiet in manner, but unshakable in conviction, and she had signed fluently even before Maya was born, because she had wanted their daughter's world to begin not with barriers, but with understanding. Danielle believed in fairness, in dignity, and in the duty to protect the vulnerable, and it was that belief that put her in conflict with the system that claimed her life. Marcus remembered the day she filed a formal complaint against a local sheriff's deputy who had slammed a deaf student against a locker for no reason other than the boy had dared to speak back. Danielle had documented the abuse, confronted the administration, and signed her name to a report that should have protected the boy. But instead of protection, what followed was retaliation. The officer walked free, his record scrubbed, his reputation preserved. And weeks later, Danielle's brakes failed on an ordinary drive home. The report called it mechanical failure. The insurance company confirmed it. But Marcus had lived his life dissecting lies, and he knew the difference between chance and message. Danielle had been silenced, and no court in the country would hear his evidence, because no judge would admit logs from programs that officially did not exist, and no prosecutor would allow a witness whose job title had been redacted from every record. Marcus had been many things in his life: an operative, a strategist, a builder of invisible systems designed to watch enemies abroad. But in that moment, watching his wife's body pulled from twisted metal, he had become something else entirely. He had become a ghost, a man erased by the very networks he had once served, living only for his daughter. He vanished from the circuits of power, disappeared from the corridors of intelligence, and rebuilt himself as a father who flipped pancakes on Sunday mornings, who drew pictures with Maya at the kitchen table, who taught her how to ride a bike without training wheels in a quiet Maryland neighborhood where no one asked questions. He became ordinary for her, or at least as close to ordinary as a man like him could manage. For years, he clung to that life, refusing every call back into the shadows, raising his daughter in a house where silence was not absence but comfort. He buried his rage, locked it away with Danielle's wedding ring in a drawer beneath sealed files, and told himself that as long as Maya was safe, he could live without vengeance. But now vengeance stood inches away on the other side of glass, bleeding out of his daughter's body. Mason had targeted her. Crow had fired at her. The city had signed papers that marked her as disposable. And Marcus felt the old steel returning, the part of him that Danielle had once said she both feared and admired. He closed his eyes and remembered her voice, soft but firm. "They don't fear our anger, Marcus. They fear our clarity, our ability to name what they're trying to hide." When he opened his eyes again, his decision was made. There would be no more hiding. There would be no more silence. This time, they would see him coming. The nurse passing in the hallway didn't notice the man's rigid posture, didn't know that the ghost standing by the glass was calculating every angle, every file, every thread of corruption that Rachel and Ethan would soon deliver. To the nurse, he was just another anxious father. But to Marcus, this was the return of a war he had sworn to leave behind. His silence was not surrender. It was patience sharpening itself into a blade. As he sat beside Maya later, slipping into the room when the staff changed shifts, he pulled from his pocket a small silver ring, tarnished with time. Danielle's ring that he had carried through every year of grief. He placed it gently into Maya's palm, curling her weak fingers around it. His voice cracked as he whispered, "You held your hands up to speak, and they made a crime." His forehead rested against hers, his breath uneven, but his words steady. "You are the reason an empire is falling." He didn't shed tears. He couldn't. The weight of what was coming didn't allow it. Instead, he let the rage harden into resolve, his mind already mapping the next steps, already turning grief into strategy. Rachel Boone and Ethan Cole were already digging into the digital evidence, uncovering contracts, budget memos, and false reports. But Marcus also knew there were human cracks in every wall of corruption. Someone always saw, someone always faltered, and someone always carried the guilt too heavy to silence forever. That someone came sooner than expected. At a crumbling old Baptist church on East Monroe Avenue, Marcus sat across from Officer Luis Ortega, a young cop barely in his mid-20s, with a badge too big for his chest and a conscience too heavy for his ears. The meeting had been arranged quietly, no records, no calls, just whispers moving through the underground network of people who still had faith in Marcus's shadow reputation. Ethan stood near the door, arms crossed, while Rachel leaned against the wall with her laptop balanced in one hand, recording nothing but observing everything. Ortega's hands trembled as he clenched his fists against his knees, his jaw working as though every word he wanted to say was stuck in his throat. Marcus sat still, his face unreadable, his presence heavy in the dim light of the church. "I was there," Ortega finally said, his voice low but steadying as he went on. "Not on patrol. I was off duty, grabbing coffee on the corner across from a library. I saw her." Marcus's eyes narrowed, though he didn't move. "You saw Maya?" Ortega nodded quickly, guilt etched into his face. "I saw her signing. My cousin's deaf, so I recognized it. I knew she wasn't dangerous. I knew she wasn't doing anything wrong. But I froze. I didn't say a word. I thought maybe they knew something I didn't. Maybe she was more than she looked. Maybe there was a reason." Marcus's voice was sharp but quiet. There was no reason. Ortega's eyes dropped to the floor. I know now. But then it was like the training, the briefings, everything Mason drilled into us. It made me second-guess what I was seeing with my own eyes." His voice cracked as he admitted, "I could have stopped it. I could have shouted. But I didn't." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low but cutting. "Why?" Ortega's lips pressed together, his eyes glassy. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of being the one good cop who speaks up and gets buried for it. Afraid of being transferred, reassigned, targeted. Mason told us in training, anyone who undermines the chain of command ends up in some nowhere post, or worse. I didn't want to be that guy, so I stayed quiet, and now she's in a hospital bed." Marcus's stare didn't soften. "You already got shot, officer. You just don't have the scar yet." The words hung in the air like a blade. Ortega blinked, shame flooding his features. Ethan's voice rumbled from the door. "He's telling the truth, Marcus. Look at him. He's breaking under it." Marcus remained still for a moment, then slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a plain flash drive, setting it on the bench between them. "You can't undo what happened to my daughter," Marcus said, his tone as cold as stone. "But you can make sure it never happens again. Give me everything. The real footage. The logs Mason deleted. The alerts he buried. You wouldn't be here if you didn't already have a copy." Ortega hesitated, his hands shaking. A long silence stretched until finally he reached into his jacket and pulled out a drive of his own, black, unmarked, no label. He set it beside Marcus's. "I don't want to die for this." Marcus stood slowly, his eyes burning into Ortega's. "Then don't. But don't live like it didn't happen." Ortega's voice cracked as he whispered, "Tell her I'm sorry." Marcus turned toward the door, his step steady. Without looking back, he said, "She doesn't need your sorry. She needs your truth." Hours later, in the dim safe house Rachel had secured, the three of them sat in a room lit only by the glow of computer screens. Rachel was already syncing the files Ortega delivered into multiple encrypted servers, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her expression locked in concentration. Ethan stood by the window, arms folded, scanning the street outside for any sign of pursuit. Marcus leaned over Rachel's shoulder, his eyes fixed on the screen as Ortega's drive revealed its contents. The footage from Hanley's body cam had been intact, unedited, and uncorrupted. Rachel pressed play. The video was shaky, the angle crooked, but clear enough to capture the truth. Maya walked past the library steps, her red hoodie oversized, her fingers moving gracefully in the air as she signed lyrics to herself. Off-camera, Crow's voice barked, "Stop moving." Maya turned slightly, her hands still floating in rhythm, and then the shot came. Her body crumpled, her sketchbook tumbled, and silence filled the frame. Rachel's voice broke softly as she whispered. She was signing a song. "Rise Up." Marcus Johnson remained still in the center of the room, his hands braced on the back of a chair, his eyes fixed on the frozen frame of his daughter lying crumpled on the library steps. He had watched the footage twice already, had burned into his mind the exact second when her small body folded under the impact of a bullet, her hands still raised in sign language, as though words themselves had been mistaken for weapons. There was no panic in the video, no threat, no justification. There was only silence and the sound of Crow's voice shouting commands at a child who could not hear him. Marcus had lived his life building systems of surveillance and counterintelligence, but never had he seen truth distilled into something so sharp, so damning, and so undeniable. When Rachel finally turned toward him and said, "It's ready," Marcus straightened and nodded once. At exactly 12:01 a.m., Rachel hit the command, and the unedited footage left their hands. It was uploaded to a private server Marcus had built years ago, mirrored instantly across 8 encrypted backups, seeded into civil rights forums, whistleblower boards, and one trusted journalist who had once owed Marcus a debt. The video was set to release without commentary, without edits, without manipulation, just raw truth. At 12:03 a.m., it hit the public timeline. At 12:07, the first 30,000 views spread across social media like wildfire. At 12:10, the hashtag #HandsAreNotWeapons trended nationwide. By sunrise, the clip had been shared more than 3 million times, replayed endlessly on phones, laptops, and televisions across the country. The footage was unbearable in its simplicity. Maya Johnson walking in her red hoodie, sketchbook under her arm, her fingers dancing in the air as she signed to herself. The command shouted off camera, "Stop moving." The child turning slightly, hands still moving in rhythm. The shot cracking, the body falling, the sketchbook scattering across the steps. Silence. No edits. No excuses. No interpretation needed. It was truth, and the world could not look away. In Jefferson, crowds swelled overnight. Teens poured out of Jefferson High, their phones raised, their signs hand-painted with phrases like "she was signing" and "justice for Maya." Grandmothers brought folding chairs and rosaries. Mothers pushed strollers with protest flyers tucked under the blankets. Fathers carried candles, and everywhere the same 3 words appeared on cardboard, cloth, and skin: "She was signing." The city did not erupt in screams or riots. It did not burn or roar. It stood in silence. Lines of people filled the streets. Stillness heavier than sirens. Silence louder than any speech. Candlelight circles formed outside the library where Maya had fallen, her sketch of a black girl flying with hearing aids taped to the wall, laminated and lit by dozens of flickering flames. Another child added his own drawing beside hers, a superhero with glasses signing the word hope. Inside the hospital, Marcus watched the live streams on Rachel's monitor. He did not join the marches, not yet. He walked the edges, listening, watching. His silence a kind of participation that carried its own weight. He had never believed in public movements before. He had spent his life believing change happened in shadows, in secrets, in files buried and then revealed. But now he saw the power of stillness, the strength of a community refusing to be distracted or silenced. He whispered to himself, "Difference is danger in this country. Always has been, but now they see it." Across town, Captain Howard Mason sat rigidly in his office, his phone pressed to his ear as the voice on the other end repeated the same tired instructions. "You followed protocol. Let it die down." But Mason knew it would not die down. He saw the footage spreading, felt the walls closing in, and for the first time in years, the weight of accountability pressed against him. Officer Daniel Crow sat in his patrol car, staring at his own reflection in the darkened windshield, his chest heaving, his voice repeating the same line like a broken prayer. "She didn't stop. I told her." She didn't stop. But his partner Hanley's words echoed back at him, sharper than any bullet. "She couldn't hear you." By mid-morning, the Washington Sentinel ran a headline, "Deadly Compliance When AI Calls the Shots." The article speculated about the role of the Predictive Threat Index, but Marcus knew better. He stood in the safe house as Rachel scrolled through common threads and whispered, "They still think it was the algorithm." Marcus's voice was quiet but firm. The algorithm was the glove. The hand was always there. Mason had set the trap that targeted his daughter, Crow had pulled the trigger, but Marcus and his team had already discovered that the corruption stretched higher, all the way to the mayor's desk. In the safe house, Rachel Boone leaned over her laptop, her eyes flicking across streams of encrypted data, each keystroke unearthing more buried evidence. "Here it is," she whispered. Internal emails between Mason and Mayor Evelyn Drake. She didn't just know about the Predictive Threat Index. She signed off on its deployment through discretionary emergency funds. Ethan Cole's jaw tightened as he read the documents Rachel pulled up on the screen. Funds meant for public schools, for safety programs, rerouted straight into Fortis defense contracts. And look at this. No council vote, no oversight, just her signature. Marcus leaned closer, his face expressionless, but his voice cold as iron. She sold children's safety to fund a system designed to criminalize them. Rachel scrolled further and unearthed a document labeled Community Stability Strategy. Its language was bureaucratic but damning. If we want to stop volatility before it spreads, we need to empower officers to act on signs of behavioral noncompliance, especially among at-risk youth. Authority must be visible. Submission must be trained. Ethan slammed his fist against the table, his voice low and angry. They wrote an instruction manual for targeting kids like Maya, for turning difference into crime. Marcus's silence was heavy, but his eyes burned with the clarity Danielle had once told him was more dangerous than anger. He whispered, "We burn their version. We burn all of it." That night, Marcus moved like a ghost through Jefferson, slipping through alleys and side streets, until he stood beneath the porch light of Mayor Evelyn Drake's house. The night was quiet, but the weight of truth pressed heavy in the air. When she opened the door, dressed in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled tight, she stiffened at the sight of the man standing in the shadows. His voice was steady as he spoke. "You signed the order to install PTI across Jefferson. You bypassed council. You rerouted funds from schools. You buried the trail under Altigen Solutions." Her expression faltered, her voice defensive. "Who are you?" Marcus didn't answer the question. Instead, he pulled a phone from his pocket and pressed play. Her own voice filled the air, pulled from a recorded internal call with Mason. "If they can't follow verbal protocol, they're a risk, especially the kids. We can't afford to second-guess threats just because they look innocent. We need officers who don't hesitate." Her face paled as she heard her words spoken back to her, the evidence undeniable. "You can leak whatever you want," she snapped, crossing her arms. "It won't stick. Public fear always outweighs public outrage." Marcus stepped closer, his eyes like steel. "Then let's find out what outweighs both." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, rattled for the first time in years. Back at the safe house, Rachel prepared the files, her fingers moving with surgical precision as she packaged the recordings, the signatures, the contracts, and the mayor's own voice into a single payload. At exactly midnight, the files went live on an anonymous platform once used for government watchdog leaks. There was no commentary, no edits, just the raw evidence, paired with the footage of Maya's shooting. Within 5 minutes, the leak was being shared on educator boards, parent groups, civil rights forums. Within an hour, it reached national press. Headlines blared. Mayor signed order that branded deaf child a threat. Marcus stood in the shadows of the safe house, arms crossed, as Rachel turned from the screen and said, "Your face is everywhere now. They know who you are." Marcus nodded once. "Good. Let them come. Because they won't find a man hiding. They'll find a father making them answer for every lie." Across town, in a hangar at the state airstrip, Mayor Evelyn Drake paced with her head low, sunglasses hiding her face even though it was midnight. Chief Nathan Hall limped behind her, his voice trembling as he spoke into a burner phone. At her side walked Marcus Fortis, contractor and architect of Fortis Defense, his chin held high, his eyes scanning for surveillance. Drake hissed, "We should already be in the air. Why are we still here?" Fortis's voice was clipped. "Flight checks take time. Besides, you're lucky we even have a window. DOJ is already sniffing. You're the one who let it spiral." Hall barked, "You said it was one kid, one incident. You said it would be contained." Fortis snapped back. "She wasn't just one kid. She became a symbol. None of them noticed the shadows closing in until it was too late. Suddenly, floodlights exploded across the tarmac. The amplified voice boomed, "Federal agents, step away from the aircraft. Hands in the air." Tactical boots thundered across the asphalt, FBI jackets gleaming under the beams. Drake froze, her mouth open. Hall spun, panic in his eyes. But two agents already had him restrained. Fortis tried to run, but a kneeling tackle took him down. His briefcase spilling across the ground, contracts and NDAs fluttering across the tarmac like broken promises. Miles away in the safe house, Marcus watched the arrests unfold on a secure feed streamed from Rachel's tablet. His face did not break into a smile. He didn't need to, because when he turned toward the hospital bed, Maya's eyes were open, her fingers warm against his. For the first time since the shooting, her hand gripped back. Her lips didn't move, but her eyes said everything. And when she lifted her other hand slowly, deliberately, she signed the words, "Am I still me?" Marcus's throat closed as he bent close, his forehead resting against hers. His voice was rough, breaking against the weight of it. "You are the reason an empire is falling." Weeks later, the Jefferson County Courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Reporters lined the walls, activists filled the benches, and cameras beamed the proceedings across the nation. The air was thick with expectation, heavy with the weight of what was at stake. At the center of it all sat Officer Daniel Crowe. His once proud posture collapsed into a shell of itself, his uniform long gone, replaced with a plain suit that hung loose on his shrinking frame. He looked smaller than he ever had, pale and sweating, his eyes darting to the floor whenever they risked meeting the crowd. At his side sat attorneys who had aged years and weeks, their files stacked high with defenses that already sounded hollow. The prosecution began not with arguments, but with sound. A recording crackled to life, filling the courtroom with Captain Howard Mason's voice, drawn from the internal communications Marcus had unearthed. "She moves her hands too much. The system flags her. Don't care what the scanner says. Those types always have something to hide." The words, sharp and cold, hung in the air, silencing the room. Faces shifted. Some gasped, others stared hard at Crowe, at Mason, at the lawyers who now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then came Officer Luis Ortega, called to the stand. He looked nervous, his hands clenched together, his voice trembling at first, but finding strength as he went on. "I told Crowe she was deaf. I told him 3 times. He ignored me. He just wanted to be right. He didn't see her. He saw a threat because Mason told us to see threats." His words cracked once, but he finished with his voice steady, his conscience finally given form. Screens lit up as expert witnesses projected the predictive threat index algorithm logs, reconstructed by civil tech specialists who had worked with Rachel and Ethan. They explained in blunt, devastating terms how the system had flagged Maya Johnson not because of any weapon, not because of violence, but because of repetitive hand motions, the same motions deaf individuals use to communicate. The criteria listed her gestures under behavioral anomalies, coded in spreadsheets and formulas as potential gang signals. The audience shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the absurdity colliding with the gravity of its consequences. Marcus sat near the back, his face carved in stone, Rachel beside him taking notes, Ethan quietly translating portions of the testimony into sign language for a live stream titled Voices Unheard, which was broadcasting the trial worldwide. And then, as silence filled the courtroom between testimonies, the doors opened and Maya entered. She did not walk. She was rolled in, her wheelchair moving slowly, her posture upright despite the weight of scars and surgeries. Her hair was braided neatly, her dress simple and black, her presence unshakable. She carried no electronics, no microphone, only a small whiteboard resting across her lap. The room shifted as she entered, as though gravity itself recognized her importance. When the judge acknowledged her, she lifted the board with both hands. On it, in thick black marker, were 4 words, "I will not die in silence." The room erupted in gasps, murmurs, and even a sob from someone in the gallery. The judge banged the gavel for order, but order was irrelevant. The words had already landed harder than any argument could. The defense scrambled, attempting to pivot. They claimed Officer Crowe had been following protocol, that he had been under pressure, that the AI system had failed him. They painted him as a man caught in the fog of flawed technology, a man doing his job. But the prosecution, armed with the files Marcus had secured, delivered the fatal blow. On the screen, highlighted in red, was an internal Fortis defense document. High sign language movement equals potential gang signaling. Increase threat level response accordingly. The clinical language was as damning as any bullet, a spreadsheet formula that reduced a child's language into justification for lethal force. Jurors shifted uncomfortably. Reporters typed furiously. The courtroom exhaled as though it had been holding its breath. Closing arguments were brief but devastating. The prosecution argued that this was not an accident, not a glitch, but a chain of decisions rooted in racism, negligence, and corruption. Crowe had pulled the trigger, Mason had set the stage, Drake had signed the contracts, Fortis had designed the trap, and all of them had profited from silence. The defense offered nothing new, their arguments limp against the tide of evidence and public outrage. And when the judge finally read the verdict, the room leaned forward in unison. Crowe, guilty on all counts, aggravated assault with intent, reckless endangerment, abuse of power, civil rights violations. Mason, Drake, and Fortis executives faced separate federal charges, but Crowe's fate was sealed in that moment. His face collapsed as the words fell, his eyes staring down at his trembling hands as though seeing them for the first time. Outside the courthouse, the steps overflowed with protesters and supporters, their silence as powerful as their signs. Reporters crowded around microphones, their voices spilling the verdict across the airwaves. But Marcus did not stand at the podium. He walked out the back, his hand steady on Maya's wheelchair, Rachel and Ethan flanking them like guardians. They did not need the spotlight. They already had something louder: impact. As they reached the waiting van, a group of students stood nearby, their hands raised in silent unison, signing the words, "We see you." Maya turned in her chair, her hands trembling but deliberate as she signed back, "Keep watching." And then she smiled, not the smile of victory, but the smile of survival, of someone who had endured the storm and now held the thunder in her hands. The courthouse steps still vibrated with the weight of the verdict, the chants of protesters outside blending with the flashing lights of cameras. But for Marcus Johnson, the real victory was quieter, found not in the roar of headlines, but in the steady grip of his daughter's hand as he wheeled her down a back corridor away from the crowd. Maya's whiteboard, with its words "I will not die in silence," had already spread across every social platform, etched into posters, spray painted onto walls, printed on t-shirts. But Marcus understood that symbols alone could fade unless they were built into something permanent. As the van door closed behind them and the city receded in the distance, Marcus resolved that his family's pain would not end in court transcripts or news cycles. It would become the foundation for change. Rachel Boone sat with her laptop open, screens reflecting in her glasses, watching the surge of data. "The numbers are unbelievable," she murmured. "Tens of millions of views, hundreds of thousands of shares, and civil rights groups already reaching out. This isn't just news anymore, Marcus. It's a movement." Ethan Cole leaned forward in his seat, his voice steady. "Movements die if you don't give them direction. What's the plan?" Marcus looked at Maya, who stared out the window, the city lights flickering across her face, her hand resting against Danielle's old ring still curled in her palm. "The plan," Marcus said quietly, "is to make sure they listen, not just hear us, but understand us." Within days, Marcus launched a simple platform called the Johnson Code. Its interface was bare, stripped of branding or flourish, just a map of the United States dotted with pins. At the top of page, one line in large type, they took her voice. "We're giving it back." The site invited families to submit their stories of profiling, targeting, wrongful arrests, and systemic neglect, particularly of children with disabilities, children of color, children whose differences had been turned into crimes. Each submission was verified, anonymized, and displayed on the map. Within 24 hours, the first story appeared. A mother in St. Louis, whose son with cerebral palsy had been frisked outside a grocery store for suspicious body language. Then came another, A father in Florida whose deaf daughter had been suspended for disrespect because she signed too quickly in class. Then another, a 17-year-old in Arizona who wrote, "I'm not angry. I'm exhausted." Within a week, the map glowed with over 10,000 pins, each one a story, each one a life that had been pushed into silence. Schools contacted Marcus, asking for training modules. Civil rights organizations requested access to the data. Pediatricians shared the platform with parents. It didn't go viral. It went necessary. Meanwhile, Maya healed. The hospital room became her stage, the safe house her classroom. Rachel rigged the camera, Ethan managed the streams, and Marcus stood behind the lens as his daughter made the decision to speak again, not with her voice, but with her hands. She insisted there would be no filters, no edits, no subtitles. Just her, just truth. The stream went live late one evening, no announcement, no countdown, just a teenage girl with a scar on her shoulder and fire in her hands. She began slowly, her fingers deliberate, translating each word into movement. For hearing viewers, Rachel's voice overlaid softly, but it was Maya's hands that people watched, hands that carried both hope and rage. "I am not dangerous," she signed, her eyes locked on the lens. "I am just different." And that alone was enough to make them afraid. She paused, the silence intentional, holding weight. They saw me signing and thought it was violence. They saw movement and thought it meant crime. They shot not just at me. They shot at the idea that someone like me could exist without apology. The silence between her signs burned hotter than sound, and millions leaned forward on their screens, drawn not by spectacle, but by truth. The live stream reached 6 million views within hours. Teenagers shared it on TikTok, parents posted it on Facebook, educators replayed it in classrooms. Hashtags exploded across platforms. Hashtag hands are not weapons. Hashtag we see you. Hashtag justice for Maya. But it wasn't just hashtags. In Massachusetts, a school board announced a new elective course in American Sign Language. In Texas, parents demanded training for teachers to recognize and respect ASL. In Oregon, libraries updated accessibility programming. Across the country, children filmed themselves signing simple words like hope, love, strength, and tag Maya. Then came the message that broke Marcus. A father in Arizona shared a photo of his son, 7 years old, autistic and nonverbal, staring at Maya's stream with wide eyes. The caption read, "My boy barely speaks." But when he saw her sign, he said, "If she can live, maybe I can be trusted too." Marcus printed that message and framed it beside Maya's bed. Change rippled upward too. The White House released a statement condemning AI-based profiling of disabled children. The FBI's Civil Rights Division opened new investigations into police departments across multiple states. Congressional hearings drafted legislation to prevent behavioral profiling from being used without oversight. Evelyn Drake, Nathan Hall, and Marcus Fortis were indicted on conspiracy and corruption charges. But none of that was what mattered most to Marcus. What mattered was the sight of his daughter, not just alive, but refusing to be silenced, her hands rewriting the rules of power. On the anniversary of the shooting, the courthouse where Crow had been convicted hosted a different gathering. Not a trial, not a protest, but a silent assembly of children. Deaf children, autistic children, children with wheelchairs and braces, children with voices that sounded different. They stood together on the steps and signed in unison, "We are not your glitch in the system." Maya stood at the center, her hands rising high, her presence radiant. The crowd didn't cheer, it didn't roar. It stood in silence, the same silence that had once been used to erase her now turned into resistance that no one could ignore. That night, as the crowd dispersed and the cameras dimmed, Marcus sat with his daughter under the hospital lamp, Danielle's ring still shining faintly in her palm. He whispered, "You reminded them who they forgot." Maya smiled faintly and signed back, "Even the quiet can catch fire." Marcus exhaled, feeling for the first time not just the weight of grief, but the weight of purpose. His daughter was alive. His wife's memory was alive. And the system that had tried to erase them was no longer untouchable. The silence that had once been a cage was now a weapon, sharp and unyielding. and it belonged to those who refused to vanish. The end. If you've been moved by Maya's story, don't just let it pass by. Hit that like button to show your support, and subscribe so you won't miss the stories that matter most. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of this journey struck you the hardest? And where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment below, and let's keep this conversation alive together.